What's going on, guys? I am back, another day, another video. Although today is not just going to be any other video. Today we are going to write some actual code.
She crashed it.
And I know, who would have thought, right? That's crazy. I say I'm a programmer, I say I'm a developer, so I figure why not write some code for the viewers? Hopefully it'll validate a little bit of what I say on this channel. This is going to be our Spotify API tutorial JavaScript video. And I know that was a bunch, but essentially what we're gonna do is we're gonna learn JavaScript by the way of using Spotify's API. Now for me, typically there is no one to call whenever a coding issue arises. If something comes up, I'm pretty much stuck on an island. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. Honestly, that's probably the best way to learn. You screw up something, you figure out what you did wrong, and you work to find your solution. However, every now and again, it's nice to have someone guide you. Nice to have someone show you their step-by-step process when it comes to coding a piece of software from the ground up. One of my goals has been to create an easy way to learn JavaScript for beginners. So hopefully through this video, we'll accomplish that. We'll actually be rendering everything using plain old HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And I know there are tons of frameworks and libraries that make development so much faster at this point. However, I've also learned that a lot of developers don't really have that foundation knowledge. And that's partly because a lot of these frameworks, while they're really fast and they make development go quick, they do so much under the hood that it's no point in knowing what's going on under the hood. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna plot out our application layout. I'm gonna show you the design approach we'll take in developing this app. The next thing we'll do is we'll talk about our coding strategy. I want you to understand the approach that we're taking as we code this piece of software from the ground up. Lastly, we'll code and we'll reference Spotify's documentation throughout the process. To design our application layout, I'm going to be using a tool called Mockflow. And no, I'm not sponsored by them, but I do think the tool is pretty solid. I'm going to be using their basic package because it's free. This is a tutorial, so I really didn't feel like paying for another upgraded package. So I think I've done enough talking at this point. Let's get to work. All right, so they have this option here at the top left, Design UI Concepts, which allows you to create a new UI project. So we will go ahead and click that. We're going to use the Bootstrap template for this project so that the concept elements will already have the Bootstrap styles applied. We'll name this Spotify Web API Project Tutorial. We'll go ahead and click Start. So the way this is going to work is that we're going to pull a list of genres from Spotify. So here's the Spotify desktop app. We'll pull a list of genres. When you select a genre such as pop, that will give you a list of playlists. When you select a playlist, that will give you a list of tracks for that playlist. That's what we're going to duplicate in our app. Once the user has a playlist, they will hit a search button to get a list of tracks for that playlist. When you click on a particular track, we'll display the track details. Maybe the track title, track artist, and maybe the album cover. Let's work. So now that we have our app layout, we're going to review the coding strategy that we'll follow. We're going to do all of our coding using VS Code. And again, this is going to be a very simple app. As you can see, we have an HTML page, a single CSS file, and an app.js file to handle all of our logic. I've already added the styles and selectors to our HTML file, and these will be used to populate our page with Spotify data. We are going to be using the module pattern for this project, specifically the pre-ES6 module pattern concept. The module pattern essentially emulates classes in JavaScript. It's widely used because it allows us to keep our code cleanly separated and organized. We can hide the implementation of certain functions from outside scope, while at the same time allowing outside entities necessary access via publicly declared functions or objects. The pattern is effectively implemented by the way of closures and ifs. For those of you unfamiliar with closures, it's essentially a JavaScript feature that allows an inner function access to the variables of its outer function. Let's say we have an anonymous function declaration. We'll assign this anonymous function to a variable called car. Inside the function, we create and initialize a private variable called speed. We then return a function called forward that's able to access the privately declared variable speed. This enclosing scope access is made available via a closure. In turn, while we cannot touch the private variable speed directly, we can update it by utilizing the publicly declared method forward. This shows the power closures can give us. Ifs are also very prevalent in the JavaScript language. It stands for immediately invoke JavaScript expression. Essentially, it's a function that's executed immediately after it's declared. Variables and functions declared inside cannot be accessed from outside scope unless we explicitly allow them by returning them. This provides data privacy as well as encapsulation. We're going to create ifs to house the separate components of our app. Each component will essentially serve as a module, hence the module pattern. Now for some preliminary talk about Spotify. For this application, we will be using their client credentials, app authorization flow, and I know that was a bunch, but essentially what's going to happen is we're going to get a token from Spotify. We will then use that token as we call future API endpoints. Having said that, we're going to start on our first module that will house all of our API functionality. So the first thing we're going to do to get that token is we're going to call their token API endpoint. This will be a post request. Also, we will be given a client ID and a client secret during the registration of our app. This will be useful in the post request as well because we are to pass that in the body of the post request. Now, once we call that API, Spotify will give us back a bearer token that we will continue to use as we call their various API endpoints. Okay guys, we're going to start with the API module. As I code, I will stop at various points to explain what's going on. Okay, so as you can see, we have the initial coding set up for our first module, our API module. It's an IFI. We know that by these two parentheses here, that will cause this function to fire immediately. Inside the function, we've declared two variables, a client ID and a client secret. We've also created a private method called getToken that will return a promise, as denoted by the async keyword set before the parentheses. So inside the function, we use the JavaScript fetch API method to call the Spotify token endpoint. This needs to be a post request. We need to specify the required content type in our header. Additionally, they require we supply a parameter called authorization with a value of basic, followed by a base64 encoded string representation of the client ID and client secret. In the body of our request, we supply a parameter called grant type that has a value called client credentials. We'll await the data from that endpoint, place it in a variable called result, and we then convert that data to JSON. The conversion method will also return a promise. In turn, we await the JSON result. Finally, we store that JSON result into a variable called data and specifically return the access token property from the JSON data. We will be able to use that bearer token to call a Spotify endpoint, giving us actual playlists. So now let's take a note of what API endpoints we're going to be calling. First, we'll use the API endpoint to get a list of categories. Next, we'll use the API endpoint to get a list of categories playlists. Next, we'll call the API endpoint to get items of a playlist. And finally, we'll call the API endpoint to get a track. So now we've created all of our API methods that we will be using to pull our data. They essentially all follow the same basic template, so I'll go over details using the first method and I'll show differences in the subsequent methods. Our first method is to get a list of genres. This method receives a token parameter because we will need to supply the token Spotify provided to us in each API call. This function will return a promise as denoted by the async keyword. We use the JavaScript fetch method to call the Spotify categories API endpoint. Per Spotify's documentation, this will be a GET request, and we are to pass a bearer token along the way in the request header. Once we receive the result from Spotify, we will then convert it to JSON, which will also return a promise. In turn, we await that conversion and store the data in the variable called data. Finally, we return an items array stored on the categories object. The next method is to get a list of playlists based on a given genre.
This method receives a token parameter and a genre ID parameter. We create a variable to hold the limit on the amount of playlists we want to receive. Using the JavaScript fetch method, we call the categories playlist endpoint supplying both the genre ID and limit, additionally supplying the requested header information. Just for clarification, we are using JavaScript template literals in our fetch API. Template literals are very versatile because they allow us to embed expressions directly inside of a string. Obviously, we're only passing parameters, but I think the code is just cleaner this way. Anyways, we will receive the data from Spotify, convert it to JSON, and finally return the items array stored on the playlist object. The next method is to get a list of tracks for a given playlist. This method will receive a token and a tracks endpoint parameter. We will have this tracks endpoint because it is included in the data set we retrieve when we first pull the playlist. So in turn, when the user selects a playlist, we will be able to access the tracks API endpoint attached to the playlist object. We declare a limit, and we pass the tracks endpoint and limit to the fetch call. We supply the token, await the results from the fetch call, await the JSON conversion, finally return the items array object. The last private method will get the actual selected track. Eventually, we will be able to display all the tracks in a list group, and the user will be able to select a specific track to view details. That said, this method will receive a token and a track endpoint which we will supply in our fetch call. We will await the result from the fetch call, await the JSON data conversion, and finally return that JSON object. Next, we return methods we want to expose to outside scope. Here we are using closures because the publicly declared getToken method has access to the privately implemented getToken method. These public methods will be called in our main app module. We are now going to start working on the functionality to handle our UI. We'll create a module for that as well. We will need to be able to populate select lists and create change events for them to interact with the API data. We've got our second module started, our UI module. First thing we do is declare an object to hold references to our HTML selectors. We do this to avoid having to type the specific selector name multiple times as we code. If we happen to update an ID or a class name in the HTML file, we'll only need to update it once here in the JavaScript file. Next, we're going to declare public methods that will eventually be called by our main controller. The first method, input field, returns an object with the following name value pairs. Essentially, the object will return the actual HTML field. This object is useful as it will allow us to attach event listeners to input fields outside of the module. Our next method, createGenre, will be used to add select options to our genre select field. The method receives a text and value parameter that will pass into the template literal. Here, we are using template literals to construct actual HTML. We then grab our genre select field using the query selector method. We pass in the genre selector using the DOM elements object we created above. We then insert the HTML into a genre select field using the insert adjacent HTML method. The insert adjacent HTML method will insert text as HTML at a specified position. We're using the before in position, which says that we want to insert our elements as the last child of the parent element. We use this coding approach to generate playlists, generate tracks, and generate details for a given track. The only difference is with the create track detail method. We grab the track detail div using our DOM elements object, and we clear it out prior to populating it with HTML. We currently have two separate modules, one for our UI and one for our API. Our UI module has no relation to our API data. Its only concern is input fields that we need access to. This is called separation of concerns. Now we're going to make a module that will utilize both the API and UI module to handle retrieving data from Spotify and populate our UI fields with that data. So we are back and we've written a decent amount of code here. We've started creating our main app module that will utilize both the UI and API modules. Ifs, like any function, can accept parameters. So we actually pass the UI controller and the API controller variables into the function. This allows us to access both modules' public methods. Passing them as parameters allows you to know exactly what variables you're working with within the app module. In turn, it eliminates confusion. First thing we do is retrieve the object referencing input elements from our UI module. If you remember, the getToken method in our API controller returns a promise. So we make this method asynchronous in order to use the await keyword, which will ensure we don't call the token-dependent methods before we actually have a token. Once we grab the token, we will store it on a hidden field within our page. Immediately after, we'll use that token to pull a list of Spotify genres. Once those genres are pulled, we will loop through each genre using the JavaScript for each method and call the create genre method on our UI controller to populate the select field. Let's take a look. As you can see, we receive the token from Spotify and we store the value within a hidden field. You can also see that our genre select list has been populated. We've also coded our genre change event. When the user selects a genre, we will first call our UI controller method to clear out the playlist select field and all subsequent elements. We then get the token that we stored in a hidden field during page load. We get the genre select field, grab the selected value, and we finally call our API method to retrieve a list of playlists for that genre. Right now, we are logging the playlist data to the console. Let's take a look. We've selected the pop genre, and you can see that we've successfully retrieved our playlist array. For each item, we will access the tracks object to grab the tracks endpoint. We will also use the playlist name. Now we'll go ahead and code our last two event listeners. We've now coded our last two event listeners. The submit button will use a click event listener. It will work very similar to the genre change event listener. We first utilize the prevent default method to prevent the page from refreshing. We then call the reset tracks on our UI controller. We grab the selected playlist value, which will be a Spotify tracks endpoint. We then get all the tracks for that playlist and display them in our list group. Lastly, we add a click event listener to our tracks div. If you recall, each track will be represented by an anchor tag inside of the tracks div. While the user will click on the anchor tag to select the track, we don't want to add an event listener to each anchor. To handle that, we use a JavaScript technique called event delegation. Event delegation is a technique that allows us to delegate a parent element as the listener for all the events that happen inside of it. So we attach the event to the parent tracks div that encapsulates all the anchor tags. When we click on the anchor element, we are also clicking on the tracks div. In turn, we trigger the event listener on that div. We can utilize the event.target to determine which element within the tracks div we actually clicked on. Now that we have the actual element, we can access the tracks div endpoint since we set that to be the value ID property on the anchor tag. We then call the API to get the actual track object and we render that to the page. Looks like our app is working as expected. We are able to load genres. We then load playlists based on the genre. When we click the search button, we pull tracks based on the selected playlist. Finally, when we click on a specific track, we are able to view the album cover, song title, and artist who made the song. So I think that about sums it up. Well done, guys.
So that's all we have for today. Guys, I appreciate you for stopping by and watching this video. This is my first tutorial video, so let me know if it was effective. Did you learn something new? Did I reaffirm things that you already understood? At any rate, I'd love to hear all the feedback. Also, please like, subscribe, comment, all that jazz, and I will see you on next time.